Hi, and welcome to this third special episode of this YouTube channel, Deconstruere. Today, it will be in English because I have invited Joe Truss, who will introduce himself, but I just briefly want to tell you how we met, or how I got to know Joe. He hosted a conference, I think, was it 2-3 weeks ago? Something like this, about white supremacy culture in the classroom. I attended the conference and was very impressed about how it was hosted, but also the conversations that it gave rise to. I have the privilege of speaking with a lot of educators within the American context, and I think we were a lot, and maybe Joe will introduce a bit more about that. But the reason I invited Joe to attend this meeting today, or to join me in this conversation, was because I like to elaborate or dig into what does white supremacy culture actually mean, and how do we see it in a classroom context. Welcome, Joe, and thank you so much for taking your time to join me today.
Hey, yeah, thank you. Good morning from the United States. Thanks for having me. It's nice to be here to start to think a little bit about what power and privilege looks like internationally, and what effect that has on all of us, specifically in the United States, on people of color, what do we do about it once we figure out that it is affecting all of us, and how do we make things a little bit better, or a lot of it better? We met in this conference a few weeks ago. I thought it was going to be a really small conference or workshop meeting. It turned out being a really big meeting and conference, and then national and then international. And, there ended up being just under 1,000 people there, or taking part of this professional development, this meeting. And people from around the country too. So people from South America, a couple people from the continent of Africa, some people from Europe, a few folks from Asia as well, but all, for the most part, educators thinking about white supremacy culture, as we call it. Some of us call it in the United States, but generally it's about who has the power, and who doesn't, and what happens as a result of that.
Yeah, and I would actually like to just ask a follow-up question to that. Did it surprise you that this was so prevalent in so many different countries around the world? That different people signed up for this conference?
It definitely surprised me how many people signed up, only because depending on how honest we are, and how explicit and direct we are with talking about the actual problems of racism, assimilation, many people are not comfortable with that conversation. And a lot of times we've been convinced that we're not even allowed to talk about them, to think about them, to explore them, let alone to do anything about them. So it was very surprising to see how many people were actually invested enough to spend their time and their money and their energy in this conversation, nationally. And then when people started signing up internationally, it was even more surprising, just because, I assume people, if they're looking for something, they're looking for something in their own country because it's their context. And that makes sense, but, it's not surprising that these issues are affecting people around the world, because if you study any pieces of history, if at least just your own country's history, or where your people come from histories, you see these elements all throughout, right? And if you're in a country that has a history of imperialism, or a history of any sort of exploitation, right, internationally, right, like going into another country and taking them over, or exploiting them, or whatever, right? Genocide. There's a lot of that, right? Not every country, but I feel like most countries can look back at least and say, maybe it was within their own land of this particular group, or tribe, or people, or culture overtook this group, right? That we don't have to look far to find those stories. Some of us got to look a little bit further back. And, some countries have very bloody histories, right? And very negative histories in the sense of going out and taking over vast pieces of the world, right? And having this colonialistic, imperialistic kind of background. And, over time, people wake up and they fight back, and, they try to dig themselves out of this hole that some of us find ourselves in.
Yeah, and yet it's not something that's necessarily available to us, that information, right? And
of course, because it is hidden, right? I mean, it's covered up because that maintains the people in power.
Yeah, and that was also for me what I found was so interesting in this conference, because there were so many people, right? That all these people had invested not only the time but also their money to actually look in the mirror and see, like, what is it that we can do to dismantle this culture, right? But Joe, before we move further, I would actually just like you to just say a little bit about what is your own relation to the classroom.
Oh yeah, sure. So I grew up, I was a kid, I went to school. I feel like anybody who is in school starts their story with, I was a kid and I was a student, so I survived. There's a lot of ways we can describe it, but, I survived 13, 14, 16 years, depending on what you count, of being a student. And somehow I still have a soul, and a personality and hope after that. And, that seeing that done mostly poorly, and then seeing some examples of it done well inspired me to be an educator, to try to be on the side of doing it well and giving kids hope. So I when I was in my college years, I decided that I wanted to be a teacher, and I was a Spanish teacher in the beginning, just because that's what I was learning. I always loved languages. I didn't grow up speaking Spanish, but I learned in the school, and just loved language and Spanish enough to decide I wanted to be a high school Spanish teacher. So that's what I did for a while. I also taught English as a second language in Honduras a little bit. And after a little bit left that, or decided that I wanted to be a leader. So I went back to school and studied school leadership and administration, as it's called in the United States, and became a assistant principal of a school, and then now principal. So I just finished my 7th year as a school leader and my 5th year as a principal of a middle school, which in San Francisco, where I live, is 6th, 7th, and 8th grade, which is about 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old kids.
All right. Yeah. So you are actually in the decision-making table.
Yeah, you could say that. I think people think that when they first get to leadership, and you realize that if all you do is make decisions, you usually don't make people very happy. And I think that gets a little bit into power as well. I think a lot of times we've only seen one model of power,
Yeah.
And even positional authority, we call it, so that if I came in, I just said, these are all the things we're doing, I would just be a dictator, and people normally don't like dictators. And you find that out pretty soon, that if you don't do it the right way and involve the people in the things that affect the people are not happy, whether they are the teachers or the students or your children, whatever, it's the same. It all comes down to power a lot of times. My best decisions are the ones that I don't make. I just help people come together so that, people feel good about the decisions and they're good for kids,
Yeah, and that's also the thing with teaching, right? It's like a lot of authenticity is important, right? So if the teachers don't believe in it, it's not really done well, right? I would actually like you to just very briefly say, how would you define white supremacy culture? Just overall?
Yeah, so I think
most characteristic elements of this concept.
Well, it is trying to clarify a power dynamic, right? Or is trying to make transparent a dynamic that already exists, with examples, right? But generally, there's not an even relationship between white people in the United States, at least as when it was first written, at least this concept, and non-white people or people of color. And because of this power imbalance, white people have more power, right? And that gets communicated in lots of ways and shown in lots of ways. And that it's not just that it's unbalanced, it's the supremacy piece means that white people are at the top, right? And not just at the top, but their ways of being are at the top, right? Their behaviors, their characteristics, their ideals, their values, right? Their morals, to a certain extent, are ideal, and then therefore everyone else is not ideal, right? And because of that power imbalance, it's not just to say that you're at the bottom and you stay there, but there's also this pressure of you actually need to be like us from the white people's perspective, right? Which easily gets into assimilation, right? And I feel like in a lot of histories, we see this idea that there's a dominant group. A lot of times we call this like international, like the dominant group, and the not dominant group, or the subjugated group, or the controlled group, right? So generally it's saying that, you know, that one culture is supreme, all the other cultures need to be like that culture. And you know, that shows up everywhere, right? In the workplace, relationships, families, family history, right? The generations of a family history. When you talk about, you know, what name you give your kids, you know, like even when me and my wife were having children and we were talking about what do we want to name our kids, you know, I'm a person of color, my wife's a person of color. You know, this idea of do we give our kid a white name or not is a big question, because in the United States, there's so much pressure on whether or not you'll be judged just off of your name, right? Because people get teased and treated poorly based on their name all the time. But there's been so many studies that show if your name sounds like a foreign name, which is really a non-white name, just on paper on a resume, you don't get a job. So generations of people have seen that, so they say, I'm going to give my kid a white name. Whether I'm 100% Chinese and my partner is 100% Chinese and my kids are 100% Chinese, I'm going to give my kid a name that sounds like they're white, right? Or a name that is from Europe or England, or an Anglican kind of name, or a name from the Bible, or whatever, right? It's like it shows up even there, right? And, you know, I'm an educator, so I look at it in schools, because a school is one organization, but those same elements show up in schools, or, you know, let's say like a tech company, or even a hospital, you know, if you work at a hospital, we'll say. So yeah, it shows up in the curriculum, it shows up in how we teach, it shows up in even the rules of what we say is appropriate or inappropriate, right? But in the end of the day, the question is who sets the rules and what are they based on, right? And what's the model, right? Like what's the ideal? What are we aspiring to be, you know? And normally, you know, if you're a strategic person or a smart person and you want to maintain your power, you say that the ideal is you. So you maintain power, right? And, you know, men have done that for millennia in culture, right? Which is why women are subjugated to feel like they're not the ideal, right? And, you know, white people many times have done that with race, right? For people of color, right? And rich people do it all the time for poor people and lower class people. That's why low class people feel like there's something wrong with them being poor, right? Their way of being, because the people in power set the rules, so that way you can never meet the rules, right? It keeps them in power.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to look at the curriculum. Like, what is it that is believed to be important, so important that we need to teach about it in school, and what is left out, what is not given that importance, right? we see it also in Denmark in terms of like, for example, when we look at the media industry, right? So journalists, but also which stories get to the news, which actors do we see get roles in movies? If they have a role in the movie, which role can they then play, right? What is the narrative around that? So we see how limited narratives there are for people of color, and especially if you're also a Muslim, right? Of course, this thing about the curriculum, this is something that we also see a lot of awareness on in Denmark now, especially Denmark's role in the enslavement of people from Africa, being the 7th biggest nation engaging in that, is something that is little by little getting into curriculum, something that teachers are becoming more and more aware of. Also, Denmark's colonization of Greenland. But there's also currently now, with this Black Lives Matter wave that we see now also in Denmark, has really sparked a lot of awareness on how do we teach and what's the role we have in the classroom as teachers. Mm-hmm. But I can't help, so for me, myself, I have also been focusing a bit, and I'm trying to dig more into the whole like concept of trauma, right? And what are the traumas that especially children of color brings with them to the school, right? And in Denmark, we see a policy, not necessarily an official policy, but we see that there is a tendency to spread children out in the classrooms, right? So you have one Black child in this class, another child in that class. So they don't group together, have a chance to group together in the classroom. They find themselves, for example, being the only Black child in that class, or the only Muslim child in that class, right? The only child with a refugee background, or so on and so forth. And one of the things that I also want to highlight from the conference that you arranged was the affinity groups, right? So the space given for grouping together with people who had the same racial affiliation as yourself, or the same historical affiliation, or the same way of being met by the dominant society or larger society. How do you think, is it something that we can create in schools as well, having a school culture that is so rooted in white supremacist culture? Is it possible for us as teachers, particularly, I'm a teacher myself, so how could we create these kind of like affinity groups, or where children can gather with people who look like themselves in a way that is supported by teachers and even like school administrations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that it's interesting you say that. So hearing you say the act of spreading kids out, for me, I would want to ask deeper questions, right? Or at least rhetorical questions in the sense of, why do we want to split them up? Mm-hmm. What happens if they get together, right? What are we scared of happening? What message is sent to them by splitting them up, right? What is the result of splitting them up, right? Over year. And also, what message are we sending to other people about those groups of people? And who does it benefit? And I feel like when people answer those questions, you unearth the underlying assumptions, right? And the underlying rules or judgments that govern kind of how we do things, right? We see some of that in the United States too. And a lot of times we do that with the hope that the kid learns or gets better. But when we dig deeper, the question is who's better and why? And it ends up being a direct connection with assimilation, right? And assimilation into dominant white culture in the United States. And to go back to the question of what happens if they get together, they start to realize, one, that it's okay for them to be who they are. And then they start asking each other questions, right? Of like, well, what's going on here, and what's our experience, and what do we need, and what do we want, right? And then you might advocate for yourself, right? As opposed to when you're outnumbered, you don't believe you have any power. You don't have anyone to kind of play with or to join your fights, right? You don't have any allies or any co-conspirators. You don't even have anyone who has your same identity. So the net result is that, you're not good enough, right? So we're trying to create that type of experience. And in the US, a lot of times people will say what's about the benefit of diversity for everybody, but it's not everybody. That's a benefit for white people or the dominant group, so that they are more exposed to non-white people. But it's not even enough to just be exposed to them, because the exposure really is just an assimilation relationship anyway. So they're not really being exposed, and the white people are not becoming less white as a result of that. They're just feeling less racist or less separate, right? Or white, I guess, right? But that's not the expectation of them, so it doesn't really always happen, right? So it's just when you start to interrogate all those things, you realize that it's really just built on a bunch of lies, and a bunch of assumptions that don't mean anything. But there's so many practices like that if we ask lots of deeper questions, we get somewhere.
And I think also it's interesting because while I have been working at the school that I'm working at now, we have had classes where you have, because they were grouped together, like the classes were made based on the elective that they had chosen, where we did see a lot of brown students basically went into the same classroom, and it was considered a problematic classroom, right? Because still they are still taught within the culture of white supremacy, right? So the curriculum is still the same. The teacher's understanding of who they are and how they behave and what is valued and what is considered good and what is considered bad, right? So it's still the same. The conversations are still had within this culture of white supremacy as well, right? So how, as a teacher, what do you think is important to question within yourself when you are having these conversations with children, especially children of color, when you also have a curriculum that you have to meet?
Yeah, I mean, I think one is, who says you have to meet that curriculum? The rules of that were probably written by someone who has power that wants to maintain their power, right? So almost any rule that we believe is fixed definitely is movable and changeable, right? We've just been told that it's not movable by the people who know that they'll lose power if we change those rules, right? Whether that's white people or men or rich people or people from a certain religious background, right? I mean, those are the winners write history, and they also write the rules, right? So in addition to that, who's to say, and if you accept that that's not fixed and it's not a mandate, then who's to say we can't teach from another person's perspective? Both the curriculum or the centering them or putting them at the center and their stories at the center. Why, who's to say that a country, in each country, a lot of times we say that you have to learn your region's history and your country's history, and then maybe later on you get to world history. And then the US, we're horrible at this. Our kids never get the world history, which is why so many people are so ignorant, because most of the time we frown upon teaching other people, because if we teach other concepts, and all of a sudden it opens up this idea that there's a way you can think differently, and we don't want people to think differently. We want to have a very nationalistic, prideful interpretation of our history. So my point there is, who's to say that in Denmark you can't study the history of the rest of the world at a young age, right? Or the cultures of the people that are actually in your school, and put that at the center, not like a add-on, not like we learn only Denmark stuff, and then for one day we learn this group, and then one day we learn that group. Because when you add it all up, people see that 150 days, one day, and they're like, okay, great. Well, I see I see where I fit here, and I see my value here. So that has to do with like the stories and the people, but even the style of teaching, right? And one piece of white supremacy culture is this focus on individualism and promoting the individual, right? The individual accomplishments, the individual work, effort, and also like glorifying the individual work. So then it ends up leading to this concept of the individual is the most important thing, right? And if you don't do it for yourself, it doesn't matter, and it's not as good as doing it with other people. The reason that one is so powerful is because so many parts of the world don't put the individual first, you know, at the heart, right? You talk to the rich people probably in those countries because class is so important. They would say individualism, right? But that promotes this idea that you can only have one person in power, right? One king, right?
Yeah.
Right. So the reason I say that is many times our people of color, our immigrant folks, are folks who are more recently from rural backgrounds. They have this attachment to other people, like they care about other people. Right? If someone's hurting, they want to help the other person. When I was surprised sometimes when I traveled around the world sometimes, and it blew me away living in the US when I would sit down and I had already eaten a meal. A friend I was with was eating, and they just gave me some of their food because they were eating. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because like if I'm eating, you're eating.
Yes.
Right. But in the US, it's like, no, fuck you. I'm eating. Exactly. This is my food, you know? And that's the idea of just possession, right? Which is so individualistic, right? Which is why you can go and exploit and enslave people, because you can go there and you could take that stuff from those people, right? But that is all, it's all rested on individualism, right? As opposed to everybody matters, everybody's human, right? Everybody deserves love, right? So let's take care of everyone, right? And that you see it in the classroom in the sense of whether kids get to work together or they don't, right? Whether we're not done until everybody's done. We're not going to move at the fastest paced person of like, oh, well, this student in the front row got it done first, so we're moving on. The 39 other people, sorry, you know, that idea, right?